Hi. So today we're talking about sexual orientation. Here's your straight up just definition of what sexual orientation is. There's a couple terms that you should be familiar with if you're not already that we're going to use when we talk today. So sexual orientation is just the way we classify people based on their preference for what we call emotional or sexual relationships. And if you're not familiar, homosexuality means same sex. Heterosexuality means persons of the opposite sex. Now, there's a whole string of letters, LGBTQ, what's called LGBTQ IA, sometimes LGBTQ plus. What that means is lesbian, gay, bisexual. Bisexual means you're emotionally or sexually attracted to somebody of either sex. The Q stands for queer. Queer means that you fall outside of what is considered a norm for gender and sexuality. So LGBTQI is intersexed, and A is for advocates. So LGBTQIA or LGBTQ plus tends to be the phrase that people use. There's also gender binary. So a person who is gender binary means that they don't identify as exclusively male or female. In other words, their gender is considered fluid. So they don't necessarily feel that they're men, don't necessarily feel that they're women, they feel like they're fluid. So gender binary means male or female, right? So gender non-binary means not exclusively male, not exclusively female. When we're talking about sexuality, sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus, one of the terms that I want you to be familiar with is heteronormativity. So heteronormativity means that society is structured around what is normal for heterosexual people. In other words, the way that we're made up as a society, we are exclusively set up to think about people in terms of opposite sex relationships, right? And even if you just think about really basic things in our society, for example, if two kids are playing and it's a little girl and a little boy, it's very common for parents to say, oh, I wonder if they're going to be married someday. I wonder if they're going to be dating someday, right? This is aside from that kind of twisted things people do where like a boy pushes a girl down and people would say like, oh, he must like you. Like, no, the action of violence does not mean that someone likes you. Let's just be clear on that. But the idea of heteronormativity is that society is really set up for heterosexual people. Here's some examples. Oh, I had some here. Your little boy is going to have all the girls go after him. Your little boy is going to have instead of saying your little boy is going to have all the boys go after him, people say, oh, all the little girls are going to be interested in him, or he's quite a looker. All the girls are going to come for him. That's heteronormativity. So one way to think about this is that heterosexuality is assumed rather than it being one possibility on a spectrum. And here's where gender non-binary tends to come into play a little bit. Heteronormativity is pushing up against this idea that people are either attracted to men or women, and that it's assumed that you're straight. Rather, what heteronormativity is pushing up against is that there are many possibilities of people you could be attracted to. And gender non-binary is saying that gender is fluid, meaning that there are a number of possibilities for gender expression. Heteronormativity is kind of pushing up against that same critique of our society. So here's some examples of heteronormativity. Number one, Disney. Now, I live in Orlando. I'm guessing a lot of you live in Orlando. We all know Disney World very, very well. Princesses always end up with a prince, right? There's always that big romantic moment in the end. There is no princess-princess relationships, no prince-prince relationships. There are rarely non-white male-female princess-prince combinations happening. It's very heteronormative, right? And we see this in a lot of animated movies, although that is changing quite a bit. But you see that in a lot of animated films where boys and girls, men and women end up with each other. So here's some questions people get that relate to not relate to heteronormativity and pushing up against that boundary. This is kind of a play on, well, which of you is the man when you have like two men in a relationship, two women in a relationship? Which of you is the fork? It's kind of like asking the same question to chopsticks. And then one way to think about heteronormativity, a good way to think about heteronormativity, is to ask yourself this question if you're straight. So when did you come out to your parents? When did you tell them you were straight? When did you have that conversation? When did you sit them down and go, Mom, Dad, I have something I need to tell you. It's very important. I'm not gay. Right? Most straight folks have never had that conversation because it's assumed, right? It's assumed that you're straight. And this is what heteronormativity is getting at. Also, when we talk about sexuality, we talk about homophobia. So there are 4 ways we can define homophobia. First is straight up fear and hatred of people who are LGBTQ plus. Second is the fear of being perceived as gay or lesbian or LGBTQ plus. Third is it's the fear of your own sexual attraction, right? So it's not just being afraid of, it's not just hating someone, or it's not the fear of a perception. It's the fear of actually this might be who I am. So I'm going to express that by being homophobic. And it's also the fear, just the straight up fear of being gay or lesbian. Okay, so when we're talking about sexuality and LGBTQ life, one of the biggest concepts that we're going to talk about is the closet, right? So this idea of coming out and you're walking out of a closet to come out. There's a little history in this. The closet, some say, was something that is opened in the 1950s, right? And we're in a post-closet society. It's also attributed to debutante balls, right? When you debut as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, etc. But the question to ask ourselves, and I think you all probably know the answer to this, is coming out of the closet homogenous? Meaning, is coming out of the closet something that is the same for all LGBTQ plus people? So with that, we have the notion of pride. So when we're talking about coming out, we're also talking about pride, because pride is often connected to someone's stage of coming out, that at some point you start to feel proud of who you are. And pride marches and pride parades started as a way for LGBTQ plus people to flood the streets and to say, we are going to be seen, and we are going to march for what we believe in. And from coming out and from pride, we get all sorts of flags. So here are just a few of the flags that I could find online that represent just sort of the gamut of LGBTQ folks. And this has been sort of socially constructed into all sorts of parts of our pop culture. If you've seen Taylor Swift's video, You Need to Calm Down, right? You'll see that she talks a lot about the Pride Parade and kind of takes on a lot of these sort of cultural significant things for LGBTQ people in a very campy way, which also is attributed to coming out and gay and lesbian life. But pride is associated with coming out, which is why we've got flags, which is why we have parades, which is why people continue to take to the streets. But the roots of it was, we're going to be seen. We're not going to be quiet anymore. We're not going to be oppressed anymore. We're going to march for our rights. So here's how sociology sort of frames a lot of the stuff with sexual orientation and sexuality. So structural functionalist theory, or the functionalist perspective, looks at how society pushes that unions between men and women are the norm. So heterosexual unions are the norm and functionalists are trying to understand why. Why do people grab onto that and hang on to it? And they do what's called institutionalized heterosexuality. So this is all of the ways that we define heterosexuality as a norm. So functionalist perspective is saying that we see this as the normal or functional, right, to borrow from the term, part of society. And why is that? why is this the acceptable way to look at, and I use acceptable in air quotes, acceptable way to look at relationships. Conflict theory and feminist theory come from a couple different angles. One is they're looking at heterosexism. So this means that when we assume that heterosexuality is the norm, this is how we encourage discrimination, right? So by saying being gay is outside of a realm of possibility, it's something that is outside of our social norms, it's something that we just can't grasp because it's just not something we see. All of those things I showed you earlier when I was talking about heteronormativity, when you encourage that discrimination, that's what conflict theory is getting at. How do people, groups, institutions, how do they continue to encourage discrimination against homosexual people? And why? Who benefits from that? Remember, conflict theory is all about power. So who benefits from that? And then heterosexual privilege. So basically, heterosexual privilege is stuff you get just by being straight, right? So it's things that are given to you by a society, by a culture, just because you're straight. You didn't have to do anything for them. So just think in terms of like representation. If you open up a bridal catalog, you fairly quickly can see heterosexual relationships being modeled for you. If you watch television, you can see heterosexual relationships being modeled for you. If you walk down the street and you are straight, you can hold hands with your partner and pretty much everywhere, and not a lot of things are going to happen to you. That is heterosexual privilege. Just stuff you get, things that happen to you, safety you can feel just by being straight. And things that people who identify outside of that, LGBTQ+, things that they don't get just based off of being identifying in one of those ways. So when we're talking about the interactionist, symbolic interactionist perspective, I want to go back to this idea of the closet, because symbolic interactionist perspective is looking at how people identify themselves as homosexual or LGBTQ+, and the process of coming out. So just the closet itself is an exercise in symbolic interactionism, because you're talking about not a literal closet, although I'm sure some people have walked out of literal closets and been like, I'm gay. But you're not talking about necessarily a literal closet. You're talking about this sort of idea of a closet and coming out of it to disclose it to people. So symbolic interaction would be interested in the closet as a symbol and what that symbol means for LGBTQ+ folks. So what does all of this mean? How does all of this apply to LGBTQ+ life, and especially in America right now? I love this meme. It came out, I'm recording this in July of 2020. So this came out last month, and I'll talk more about what happened last month in a second, in June. But one way to look at heteronormativity, to look at interactionist perspective, to look at conflict and feminist perspective is this very simple statement. If you have never had to have a Supreme Court decide your rights, then you have some sort of privilege, right? If you've never had to have a Supreme Court case decide if you have the same rights as others, then you have privilege. Meaning that if a law has never had to be passed in order for you to do what everybody else gets to do without a law being passed, you have some sort of privilege. And currently, right now, in 2020, to this day, there is a ton of stuff that LGBTQ+ people are fighting for. There's some stuff they've gotten, and I'll talk about that. But when we're talking about a society and institutions and being embraced, and what heteronormativity means, and what homosexual or what sexism means, and what homophobia is, it's very much rooted in our social structures. So here's a few examples. When we're talking about inequality, so in 2009, Congress passed federal hate crime laws. This was a reaction to a lot of things. A lot of people attribute it back to the murder of Matthew Shepard. I'm going to put a link after this lecture that talks about the Matthew Shepard and what happened with him, so you can sort of familiarize yourself with him. Please take a minute and watch it. Matthew Shepard's murder is probably one of, I'd say, if not the turning point, it's one of the turning points in the US in terms of changing perspectives on and changing laws on LGBT life. In 2012, California became the first state to outlaw conversion therapy, which means some sort of therapy that will change you from being gay or straight, or from being gay to being straight. And this brought its own kind of slew of problems. Conversion therapy was very well known for using electric shocks and using sort of just really harmful things to try and shock people, literally and figuratively, out of being gay. The Defense of Marriage Act. Prior to 2013, the Defense of Marriage Act permitted states to ban same-sex marriage, and gay and lesbian marriages were not recognized federally. So the Defense of Marriage Act was created specifically to defend marriage, it's in the title, and to try and keep people of the same sex from being married. They were denied common legal protections. I listed some of them on here. Adoption became something that could be contested under Defense of Marriage Act. And in Florida, it wasn't until 2010 that same-sex couples could adopt as couples. And there's still states that will not allow same-sex couples to adopt in the US. Usually it means that one partner has to do the adoption. And a lot of times they have to have an opposite sex person signing on as the mother or father to the adoption, regardless of if they're in a relationship with them or not, or have been. So adoption is one, custody of children is another, guardianship, Social Security, inheritance when someone passes, even if you had been with them for their entire life, 30, 40, 50, whatever years, you were not entitled to their inheritance when they died. You also weren't entitled to things like, it also means you're not entitled to things like hospital visits, decisions about medical care, decisions about end of life. All of that sort of became sort of underneath the banner of Defense of Marriage Act. So in 2013, the Supreme Court found that DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, was unconstitutional. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that states could not keep same-sex couples from marrying. So this is sort of the big legal decision, right, that was made in 2015, that their union needed to be recognized. However, there's so many areas to still tackle when we talk about LGBTQ plus life and what people get in terms of rights. Employment is a big one. 1 in 4 LGBTQ plus employees experienced employment discrimination in the last 5 years. Just last month, in June of 2020, it was kind of a surprise for a lot of folks. The Supreme Court ruled that LGBT people are protected from employment discrimination. So that was a big ruling. But again, it gets back to the statement I made earlier. How has the court ever had to decide on your rights? This ruling said that LGBTQ plus people are a protected class and should and cannot be discriminated against. And the court case that sort of decided this was a woman in Michigan who had come out as transgender to the people in the company she worked for. I think it was a plumbing company. And she was immediately fired after that. And she was in her 70s and had spent most of her life living as a man and said, I need to live my life as a woman in her 70s, and was fired for it. So that was the case that this decision was based off of. People call professional sports the last closet. You see, there are a few LGBTQ plus folks in sports, but in what people consider mainstream sports like NFL, baseball, basketball, you don't see a lot of folks coming out, specifically men. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or what was called DADT, was banned out homosexuals from serving in the military. Don't Ask, Don't Tell basically was what it was in the sentence, right? We don't ask if you're gay, you don't tell us if you're gay. And in other words, just keep it quiet. Don't talk about who you are, which is extremely problematic for folks if they have a family, if they have children, if they have a partner. But this was the way sort of around banning people from being gay from serving in the military. If they were found out to be gay or lesbian, they were discharged. That ended in 2011. Last is this non-discrimination protection. So non-discrimination protections means that if you are LGBTQ plus, you were denied things like credit, If you were a student, you could be denied entry into a university. You had no protection against public harassment or discrimination for you. Also, LGBTQ plus youth are really overrepresented in the foster care system. And an average lifespan for a transgender woman of color, particularly Black transgender women, is 35. I put a link in Canvas for more information on the murder rate of transgender people. The likelihood that transgender, particularly Black transgender women, but transgender women of color, the likelihood for them to be killed or harmed in their lifetime is insanely high. And it's something that is very concerning. So these are a few of the ways that we've sort of taken one step forward, two steps back when we're talking about LGBTQ plus rights and when we're talking about sexuality and sexual orientation. And that is it. I will see you all later. Bye.